How do the portraits of a nation's celebrated figures shape that nation's image of itself? Simon Schama looks at portraiture, history, and identity in his book, The Face of Britain.
You somehow look at this painting, you may not know any of the backstory about pain and redemption and duty and virtue, and you still are somehow incredibly immediately affected and engaged and gripped and feel powerfully in the presence of this particular man.
What do Salman Rushdie, Bill Clinton, Lauren Bacall, and Toni Morrison have in common? They all answered to the same legendary editor. Robert Gottlieb is here to talk about his memoir, Avid Reader.
Finally, I had this vision of 22. I called Joe in the morning and said, I've got it, 22. It's even funnier than 18.
Also, literary news and what we and other people are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. When Britain's National Portrait Gallery opened its doors in 1856, the plan was for it to be more than a museum. It was both a history lesson and a press release designed to tell the British people who they were, as author Simon Schama puts it. His new book on the National Portrait Gallery and its vast collection is called The Face of Britain, a history of the nation through its portraits. And I'm so happy to have Simon with me now. Simon, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So I have to say that I love the weight and heft and beauty of this book, and I hope it doesn't scare people off. This is a heavy book. It's not big.
Hey, it's a pamphlet, Pamela.
It's beautifully,
by my standards.
Yeah, no, it's right. It's beautifully produced, though, and it's full of art, as one would hope and expect, given the subject. And it's an unusual collaboration. Can you talk about the genesis of this book?
It began actually as a National Portrait Gallery exhibition on the heels of Neil MacGregor's wonderful 100 Objects, History of the World in 100 Objects, based on the British Museum. The National Portrait Gallery thought maybe they could really present their collection in 100 perfect portraits. Portraits, it struck me, because eye contact is all important, as you know, I make rather a big deal of that. It's harder to do on radio, I think, although you and I could sit here and I'm sure describe a portrait very colourfully. So it was thought it should be a TV series, and with the TV series I wouldn't want to do it unless there was a book. So it was this triangulation between a show in London and a television series and the book. And I knew very early on that I didn't really want to do a kind of slog through from the beginning of portraiture in the 16th century, where the weight is taken off the charisma of looking at images in the face of Christ and the Madonna to the King and Queen. But I really wanted to do it thematically. So one chapter and one film was about power, another one was about intimate portraits of love, a third about self-portraits, and what we're all interested in, how portraits develop fame, how the face actually is a lightning rod for kind of public awareness and public connection. I was just struck on the commuter train this morning into the city by everybody sitting on the train with their head bowed at their phone, of course, actually.
No, it's so
my
sad.
mum used to talk about the look-down generation, actually, before she died. And you and I are not doing this. We're staring into each other's eyes.
Right, but in the future, all portraits will be of people's foreheads.
Very likely, or some designated feature, yeah.
So how did that work, like just logistically, with the TV show, the book, and the exhibit going on simultaneously in development?
Pretty
How did
much.
that? Yeah.
The television takes a lot of kind of front loading and preparation. So you have to find people, you find stories, you find locations. The thing is to write a huge chunk of it, know what you're doing in advance, but not the whole thing. So I suppose, in effect, a first draft of the book was written before we started filming. And then all sorts of modifications happen, partly because there are a lot of portraits of relatively by unfamiliar artists and of unfamiliar people, as well as the Churchills and the John Lennon. There's wonderful Isaac Fuller, this rowdy, flamboyant kind of painter of pubs and taverns in the 17th century, people like that. So I think the answer to your question is chaotic but ultimately successful. There's that fantastic line in Shakespeare in Love that Geoffrey Rush, it all looks as though it's going, as we say in Britain, pear-shaped. And someone says, well, isn't this a disaster? And he said, yes, it is, but I don't know, somehow all's well that ends well. That's kind of my motto too.
Well, it all looks very nice
Thank
in
you.
book form. Let's talk a little bit about that origin of portraiture, as you mentioned earlier. Was portraiture one of those things that painters and artists sort of snuck into religious painting in the same way that they would paint many other things in the background as something that they were interested in?
Well, in Britain, they have a job to do. For throughout the Middle Ages, you do paint the king, literally, for once the word is rightly used, as an icon, so an image of devotion. But obviously, only a limited number of people are going to go to Westminster Abbey and look at Richard II. So it's when, in fact, actually, King Henry VIII cuts Britain off from the world of the Roman Church, all that weight of devotion has to be transferred from the protective authority, the power to bind and loose of Christ. And we found, as you know, this wonderful kind of fresco dating from before the Reformation in this kind of funny old house on the suburbs of London, and transferred to the king. And immediately you have a kind of industry of portraitists, some of whom might have worked as book illuminators in the late Middle Ages, some not, and foreigners like Holbein, who's more used to doing that. And their job is really to present an official image. We are already in the world in which politics counts on the look, exactly the world we're in now. And one of the things that I was stunned by, and I didn't know until I did the research, was that 1563, Elizabeth I's Council of State lays down rules for authorised and unauthorised portraits of the Queen. England's are divided countries in a religious civil war, and the terror was that the Queen's face, badly painted, would be used for scurrilous satire. So it was actually legislated that no one was allowed to produce images of the Queen unless they were officially licensed. That was a startling beginning of an awareness how matters of power can turn on how a face is presented to people.
Do any of those unauthorized portraits still exist?
There are a number of crude, kind of cartoonish. It's difficult to sort out, basically because the young queen is a success, and so everybody, in their little kind of workshops, and they may have been goldsmiths and engravers and tavern sign painters are doing that, and some of those still survive. But pretty early on, it's all then bound back into official policy and official commissions.
Did you find that there was something that really distinguishes British portraiture from other sort of European approaches to portraiture?
Just as it was extraordinary that Shakespeare's history plays happen when they are, and they present very earthy, sacred, rather informal images of kings in their night shift in states of panic, that sort of thing. So too, the kind of range of possible faces. The most striking, extraordinary thing which made me feel that way was Oliver Cromwell, who was not without vanity and not without temptation of becoming a king himself. Hiring Samuel Cooper, the militarist, to paint his portraits. Famously, he said warts and all. He's supposed to have said that to a different artist, Peter Lely, but we're all convinced he said that to Cooper. And so for him, his title to sovereignty, to people's allegiance, became the painting of plainness, became the painting of naturalistic truth. So you have a whole regiment of warts marching over his face, and the worst comb-over in the history of all portraiture. That would not have happened in the court of Louis XIV. It would not have happened in the court of the King of Spain. Even Velázquez, at his cheekiest, wouldn't really have done that. So there is in Britain, I think, early on, and certainly by the time you get to the 18th century, a sense in which sovereignty depends on popular connection in some sort of way, I think.
I'm sure that there were many interesting and odd stories behind the pictures in the gallery that you discovered. But one that I've heard, and I'm curious if it's true, I think is it James Scott, one of the Scotts who was beheaded, and then he hadn't had his official portrait done, and so they actually had to sew the head back on. And...
I didn't know that, Pamela, actually. It's not in the book. I obviously should have called you.
No, it's probably apocryphal. But
posthumously beheaded portraiture.
Yes, right. That apparently
Did they do a good job?
The little, I haven't seen it, but apparently you could see the little... All right, well, tell us some of the things you did see that were
things are really
surprising.
Extraordinary. The National Portrait Gallery has reproduced in the book the first surveillance photographs ever I think, done with a camera, particularly designed for the purpose of women, of dangerous women, of suffragettes. And the reason is that the suffragettes, as you know, took to attacking artworks, including the Rokeby Venus, in the National Gallery. So there were two reasons the government, the Liberal government at the time, were in about 1911, 1912, when suffragettes get very militant indeed. There are surveillance photographs taken by this rather awful man, Norenko, standing on stepladder, looking over the walls of Holloway Prison. And then those photographs are circulated to every likely target, every museum, every art gallery, every theatre, and so on. And we forget some of them were actually making bombs. But these photographs are extremely poignant because very often many of the women have been on hunger strike, been force-fed. Some of them are really involuntarily beautiful images. In a portrait gallery, somehow, even though by the 1920s it wasn't the kind of thing that they would want to preserve, they did. So those were incredibly powerful images to me, I think, really. And
did you go through all of the portraits that aren't on current display in the
Yes,
National
and also
Gallery?
we use the portrait gallery is very kind. It's not just, even though those of you reading the book perhaps might go there. It's a wonderful institution. We did use a number of images that aren't there as well. Annie Leibovitz was actually they do have one of those beautiful prints of John and Yoko just 5 hours before he was shot. But there are a number of things that we also, for example, those extraordinary eye portraits. And if you saw eye rings, okay, George IV, the Prince Regent, he had a kind of a modus operandi where he'd always have a miniature of himself sent to whichever skirt he happened to be chasing at the time. And of Mrs. Fitzherbert, who he was deeply in love with and married secretly for a while, he sent a ring with one of his eyes, both magnificent and deeply, deeply creepy.
Yeah, I was going to say, very disturbing.
She was off in Europe. She wanted to have none of him to begin with, but she couldn't not receive the eye ring. So I kind of imagine, she put it in the drawer. In fact, I think she says she does that. But then, of course, it's lurking there in the drawer.
You know it's there.
And it worked. She surrenders, actually. So anything to get the other eye, I suppose. So that belongs to an aristocratic family who are kind enough to let us film it and talk about it and use it in the book. Then, of course, there is the destroyed portrait by Graham Sutherland and Winston Churchill. Destroyed because the family hated it so much. The portrait with which the book begins, that was being given to him by Parliament on his 80th birthday. It survives in transparency, which is why we have it. The family is still incredibly exercised and sort of upset. This portrait was done in 1954, so it's a long time to be getting over it. And at one point, they weren't at all sure they wanted it in the book. And I said, well, if not, and they had the right to deny us permission. I said, fine, then we'll have a white page and explain why people are looking at a white page.
Why didn't they like it? What upset them so much about it?
Well, you'll have to judge, and all the readers will have to judge. Churchill, of course, was a painter himself, so he thought he was in a collaboration with Sutherland. Sutherland's thing was a kind of naturalistic earthiness. Churchill had had a stroke, and he'd got over it very, very well. There was some rather nice PBS docudrama with Michael Gambon about it. And he had agreed to leave the premiership. So this is around the time of the Queen's coronation. But he kept changing his mind. And he was being pushed out of the door by his colleagues. So he couldn't say, I don't want a birthday present for a portrait. And this big public occasion, outside broadcast, televised, huge national occasion of thanks. But he wanted to be presented as sempiternally vigorous and robust, the bulldog, the lion, and so on. And what Sutherland portrayed is not this decrepit invalid, he wasn't that anyway, but someone who was, I describe him as a magnificent ruin. And it's a dark painting in a sense in which it's massive. He's an old man, but he's an old man who's experienced his own and the nation's triumph. They just, on sight, hated it so much. I mean, he famously, on television, received it and turned to the audience, thousands of people, and the audience on television said, "This is a very remarkable example of modern art." And everyone did what you're doing, except Sutherland, who's caught on camera, who, of course, is incredibly humiliated. And people, great and good, come and look at it, and some like it, some don't like it. And it goes back to Churchill's house. And one evening, Churchill's wife's secretary's brother comes in a pickup truck and takes it to a waiting bonfire. And then there was an issue because it was thought it was supposed to go back to Parliament after Churchill died. Not sure that's true. I think they're right in saying it was their own property. But we've lost one of the great, I hope readers will agree, feel free to disagree, everyone out there, but we've lost one of the absolutely great portraits in both British art and British history, I think.
So if casual visitors to the National Portrait Gallery in London might go in and they look for the famous people and they see, right, all of the kind of big... But if you could say to a visitor or to a reader of this book, right, yes, all of these famous people, but be sure to see...
I would say he's I'm not sure how famous he is in here. The portrait done by Thomas Lawrence, who's a kind of glamourist of the good and the great in the very early 19th century, portrait of William Wilberforce, who devoted his life to abolishing the slave trade and succeeded, and indeed to slavery itself, but he died before. And he was one of the world's most wonderful people, really. Lawrence, both of them die, and it's an unfinished portrait because Lawrence dies and Wilberforce follows him. What the world didn't know, really, was that Wilberforce had a very crippling spinal deformity and wore this, particularly at the end of his life, this ferocious metal contraption to keep his spine from really completely collapsing. Lawrence has him sort of leaning a bit off kilter like that. And he turns the pain into informality, into informal address. And there is the beginnings of this rather beatific smile on, which is hard to get right. Smiling portrait is very hard not to be creepy, I think, on Wilberforce's face. And you somehow look at this painting, you may not know any of the backstory about pain and redemption and duty and virtue, and you still are somehow incredibly immediately affected and engaged and gripped and feel powerfully in the presence of this particular man. And his charm. He was very, very charming.
So before letting you go, reluctantly, I have to ask you the one question that I guess everyone must be asking a British person when they're in the room these days about Brexit.
Right.
And, when you have a book called The Face of Britain, of course, it's a changing face. And I'm curious if you see in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery that changing image of what the United Kingdom looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I guess I want to say, as those of us who are arguing passionately not to leave the European Union, that Britain has been much more a country of immigrants than we often think, actually. Ira Aldridge, the great New York black actor who made fame as an Othello in Britain, is in the book. And there is a kind of white, or as E.M. Forster said, pinko grey when describing the British. There is a much more of a complicated and rich range of complexions and looks in the face of Britain than you would imagine. So it's slightly very mortifying for someone who's both an art historian and a historian to have heard the kind of rhetoric, hello, election here, 2016, a kind of mythology of what it means to be British, which is much more a face like yours and mine. The painted history of the British does not necessarily, to its credit, reflect that. It's a much more expansive and generous and ecumenically hospitable iconography, and long may that be the case.
Excellent. Simon, thank you so much.
Such a pleasure, Pamela.
And I urge readers to pick up, as I said, a very heavy book, but for all the right reasons, because it's beautifully produced with excellent color images. The book, again, is The Face of Britain, A History of the Nation Through Its Portraits by Simon Schama. Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about what's going on in the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What is going on?
So you might have noticed a new book that's #1 on our nonfiction bestseller list in hardcover, ebook, and the combined print and ebook. That's by Glennon Doyle Melton, and it's called Love Voyeur. And at first it looked like this came out of nowhere, but of course it didn't. This was a selection by Oprah for her book club. And so I was curious how big the Oprah bump is these days now that she no longer has her talk show, where she launched so many authors' careers. And many of the authors that she hosted, many of the authors who she selected for her book club went on to sell millions of copies. Of course, now Oprah has her own network. She has her magazine, but she doesn't have that platform that she used to have. So I was curious what kind of sales effect it has when Oprah chooses you.
Do tell.
So for Glennon Doyle Melton, it was pretty enormous. Her previous book sold 35,000 copies, which is pretty good,
Yeah,
actually.
that's a very
these
respectable
days.
figure.
Very respectable. So her publisher was planning on this being even bigger. They were planning on a print run of around 100,000 copies. And then when Oprah picked the book for her book club, they tripled that, and they printed 300,000 copies. And so far, they feel like that's been right on target. The first week's sales were 60,000 hardcovers, 25,000 ebooks, and 11,000 audiobooks. So that's pretty enormous. And of course, this comes with more than just Oprah's stamp on it. Because Oprah chose her, she was on CBS This Morning on the publication date. The magazine had a spread devoted to her and an interview and an excerpt from the book. So there's all these ripple effects as well. Another kind of example that was recent that we saw was with Colson Whitehead's novel, The Underground Railroad, which had an enormous sales boost as well. That came out in August, and they were planning on printing 75,000 copies because booksellers had placed such strong orders. And then once they realized that Oprah was picking it for her book club, they boosted that to 145,000, and now they have nearly 300,000 in print for that novel.
What did the bump used to be like? Have you looked at any of the historic data of books sort of back when she had her TV show and she was, hosting a big book club on it?
Well, I think my impression is that the bump used to be bigger, and it's easier to determine that when you're looking at a brand new author or someone totally unknown. Examples like Wally Lamb's She's Come Undone. That went on to sell millions of copies. So did Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth. And these were people with no profile. Colson Whitehead is a pretty well-established literary writer. Mm-hmm. This book was already getting tremendous pre-publication buzz. It's now been nominated for a National Book Award. So he was always kind of on this trajectory.
Right.
But I think this has helped commercially for sure.
All right. So authors, just get your books on Oprah and you'll be all set.
You will be fine.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Even if you've heard of Salman Rushdie or Toni Morrison or Robert Caro, the name Robert Gottlieb may not ring a bell. Gottlieb is the man responsible for bringing the books of these and many other authors into being. He's a reader's reader, and his memoir is fittingly called Avid Reader, A Life. He joins me now. Bob, thanks for being here.
Sure.
Is this a book that you always knew you wanted to write, or did you have to be dragged into it, or how did you come to write it?
No, I certainly never wanted to write it. I didn't even want to be writing it when I was writing it. But I had to write it because I said I would. No, I resisted the idea for many, many years because it seemed pretentious and because I had too much else to do other than think about myself. But eventually, I decided to do it, partly because my publisher was very eager for me to do it, Lord knows why. But more important, my daughter wanted me to do it, partly for herself, but also for her two twins who are 13, her twin boys, and she wanted them to have some kind of record of their grandfather's life. So what my daughter orders, I obey.
Excellent. Well, to the benefit of many readers.
Thank you.
Who I think, know your name and they think, right, Robert Gottlieb, the New Yorker, or Robert Gottlieb, Knopf, or Robert Gottlieb, dance critic. And of course, you have been all of these things. Can you tell us a little bit about your career path, just starting from the beginning?
My career path started with a year and a half of not being able to get a job. I'd been to Columbia, I'd been to Cambridge in England, I was married, I had a child. But I didn't have any work because it was the 50s. I was a scruffy kid who looked 5 years younger than I was, and nobody was interested. Finally, I blundered into a fabulous job, which was as assistant to the then sort of editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster, when Simon & Schuster was small and fun and a barrel of laughs, it really was. And I just loved it from the first moment, and I was there 12 and a half years, and rose to be editor-in-chief myself in my last years there. And then I moved to Knopf to sort of be the head of it. And there I stayed for 19 or 20 years. And then I went to the New Yorker for 5 or 6 years. I decided I didn't want to run anything anymore, although I had enjoyed running things when I was running them, but I had done it. I was in my early 60s, so I just wanted to edit. And I went back to Knopf just as an editor, and I'm still there, editing away. And then I started to write, and I wrote a lot of stuff. I wrote a number of books. I wrote 20, 30 pieces for the New York Review of Books, for the New Yorker. I wrote for the Times Book Review some time ago, a lot of stuff. I became the dance critic of The Observer, blah, blah, blah. So here I am. That's
That's a lot of blah, blah, blah in there.
A whole lot of blah, 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 right.
You've written a number of biographies, Sarah Bernhardt, George Balanchine. What was it like to sort of turn to yourself, and how different was it to write a memoir as opposed to, a big biography?
Well, it was very different. See, the reason I wrote those other books and most of the pieces I've written is because I was so interested in the subject, so I could burrow in and spend weeks, months on research, reading 30, 40 books for a given piece. And since I wasn't living off my writing earnings, and there was no time pressure most of the time, I could just indulge myself. Then, of course, I had to do the writing. I'm not someone who enjoys writing because it's hard, It's a lot harder than editing, it turns out. But since I said I do it. Since my basic rule of life is get it done. So I got it done, and I wrote those books fairly quickly, but I knew what I was talking about because I'd done so much work. When I turned to myself, I wasn't very interested because I had done it. So there was no research I could do about me. So there was just me and typing, and that is not my favorite thing to be doing.
Did you keep diaries? Did you have...
Oh, no diaries, nothing. I didn't look at anything. Once or twice I had to call some people to see if they remembered something, like Toni Morrison, whom I've edited almost from her second book on, with just, I think, one exception. And we're very close and spent a lot of very happy editorial time together. Toni, like any writer, remembers anything I ever said, because writers remember editors more than editors remember writers. So Toni was always able to tell me, oh, you said this, oh, you got me to do that. So that was helpful. But other than that and a couple of other people, no, I just relied on my memory and talking to my wife. She remembers a lot, and that was it. So I immediately knew the structure because I have a very structured mind, and then I just did it like a job. But I like jobs, I'm one of those people who loves work.
Well, you've had fun jobs. Let's talk about the first one at Simon & Schuster. 13 years is a very short time in which to rise from that entry level up to editor-in-chief.
Well, it is, but Simon & Schuster was unlike any other place. And also during that time, I always felt I came in as cabin boy, and everybody was rooting for me to be admiral. Actually, not everybody was, I guess, but I felt that way. It made you feel that way. But also the firm went through tremendous convulsions during that period. The ownership changed, people died, everybody left, and suddenly half a dozen of us, of whom I was the youngest, was just running it. I'm talking about the trade department.
Mm-hmm.
So from the very start, almost, I was in on decision-making. And because I'm a busybody and I was fascinated by everything, I was soon sort of doing everything. It just happened. So as I think I put in the book, most places or most people may have to leave a place and go to another place to climb the ladder. But there wasn't a ladder. One day you were doing it and it was fine. And I was either smart or lucky or both, and had a lot of successes, the most famous of which was Catch-22, but there were many others. And then when Knopf became available, which was the great American quality publishing house, which I had grown up on, half my books were Knopf books, it was irresistible to go and run it. So I did.
Let's go back to Catch-22.
Sure.
Part of what makes your book a joy to read is all of the great stories and, of course, the gossip. But tell us a story about Catch-22.
Well, there are a lot of stories about it, starting with the famous change of title, because it was supposed to be called Catch-18, and it had always been called that by all of us who loved it. And then suddenly, just as we were preparing to publish it in 1961, I think it was announced that Leon Uris's new book was going to be called Mila 18. He had just written Exodus, which was one of the biggest successes of the time. And so we obviously couldn't follow Mila 18 with Catch 18. So we had a crisis over the number, which went on for a long time because none of us could agree. And finally I had this vision of 22, I called Joe in the morning and said, I've got it, 22. It's even funnier than 18. Well, this was a complete, as you can see, you're laughing. It was total self-delusion, because no one number is funnier than any other number. But we needed to be convinced, so we bought it. And the book just grew and grew and grew. It was never a huge bestseller in hardcover, but it never stopped selling. And because nobody was observing what we were doing, my great friend and colleague Nina Bourne, who was the advertising genius of publishing, we just kept advertising it. Nobody told us not to, so we just did. And then when it hit as a mass market paperback house the next year, it exploded. This was, of course, during the Vietnam War. And people read it as a commentary on the war. When Joe started writing it, there was no Vietnam. There was barely a Vietnam. There was no Vietnam War. There was barely a Vietnam in our consciousness. So it sold millions and millions of copies, and it's still selling. And probably the book I'm most associated with, although I didn't read it for 50 years until the 50th anniversary when I had to talk about it, so I reread it. And luckily, I still loved it. That was a good thing for me.
What another book, famous book that has a big anniversary this year that you edited, The Chosen. The
Chosen, Chaim Potok's wonderful novel. Yes, that had a very peculiar beginning. In those days, which was before Xeroxes or anything, we would get a manuscript from an agent. Usually, if it had been around the block, it was dog-eared. And this one was, and it came from an agent I didn't really know. And when I read it, I saw why so many people had not taken it, which was because halfway through the manuscript, the novel came to an end, and then another novel was attached to it. So I called up the agents and said, look, I love this, and I'm happy to publish it, but only if Mr. Potok will agree that the book ends here and doesn't go on for another 300, 400 pages. Well, he did agree, and that started our lifelong relationship. We went on publishing together until his death. And it was a book about two Jewish boys during World War II, one Orthodox, one Hasidic. Their fathers were rabbis. The metaphor for the book was Brooklyn. I mean, there was no way to make this combination of stuff into a bestseller. And yet, it started, people loved it the way we did, and it crept up the bestseller list to number one, and it's still selling. And as you say, there's coming out a 50th anniversary edition now. I'm
going to list some of the big names, the authors you've worked with over the years, and then we can talk about a few of them. But
sure.
Toni Morrison, you mentioned, John Cheever, Doris Lessing, John le Carré, Michael Crichton, Lauren Bacall, Katharine Graham, Robert Caro, Katharine Hepburn, Barbara Tuchman, Nora Ephron, and Bill Clinton. And that's quite a lineup.
It is, but there were a million more, half of whom you've never heard of, because that's the way publishing works.
Who was the writer that you first worked with that sort of made you realize, like, this is it, this is what I want to be doing, there's a joy in this, the satisfaction of bringing a book to readers?
Well, those are different satisfactions. Bringing a book to readers, which is what we call publishing, was always exciting, no matter what the book, whether it was a success or not, because it's fun. Because what publishing really is, in my definition, it's making your own enthusiasm for a book public and conveying it to others and sharing it with others. And that's always the thrill. As for editing, I don't know what I thought about it. I mean, I just did it. Sometimes it was interesting, sometimes it was painful.
When was it painful?
Well, it's no fun to tell a writer that there's a serious problem with his or her book, or in very rare cases that it wasn't a book one could publish, and you thought maybe it would be better to shelve it. However, it's got to be done, and it is done. And sometimes it couldn't be easier and smoother, and other times it's contentious is too strong a word, because this whole myth of editor and author at odds with each other is ridiculous. You see, if it's working properly, the author understands or gets the fact that the editor is in deep sympathy with what has been written. Mm-hmm. Once that's understood, there's really no problem. There may be a problem over details, but there's no conflict. Like Robert Caro and I are always raging at each other about some semicolon or other. It doesn't mean anything. He knows I love his work. I know I love his work. We're very fond of each other. We have the same goal. And sometimes it's a difficult goal because, as with The Power Broker, his first wonderful book, we eventually ended up cutting. We're not in total accord, but we think it was about 300,000 words. That's cutting 300,000 words.
And it's not a short book in the end.
It is far from a short book at the end. I mean, it's not that I wanted to lose those words. Most of them were wonderful and fascinating, but there was just no way you could bind a book longer than the one we did. And he understood that. But that didn't make it easy because we were both giving up material that we liked. Remember, always it's the author's book, as any sensible editor knows, and it's not our job to force writers to do what they don't want to do. Our job is to have feelings and convey them sensibly and dispassionately and hope that they take. Sometimes they don't, but most of the time they do because, as I say, writers are not fools, and they understand when there's a sympathetic impulse to make what they've done even better than what it is. So I would say in my endless career, which is now over 60 years, I can't really remember times, or more than a few, if that, where I was in contention with the writer. And also, as I try to make clear in this book, some writers love reworking. They love rethinking. John le Carré was like that, is like that. You know, you give him a suggestion, if he likes it, he's thrilled. He wants more. He'll do it all. He loves to dive back in. My beloved friend Doris Lessing was not like that. Not that she resisted, but when she was done with the book, she was done with it. Her mind was elsewhere. She might do some cosmetic work, you know. That was not a problem. But she wasn't going to rethink it. She was thinking her next 10 books. With Toni Morrison, for instance, if I tell her something, she instantly gets what I mean. If she responds in a certain way, I totally understand. Although people think of her as a diva, she's not like that at work. She's utterly open and responsive. But it's different from everyone, and that's part of what makes it so interesting.
I have to ask you one final question. What's the last great book you read, or the last book you just really enjoyed reading?
Well, I can tell you because the Times Book Review gave it a fabulous, deserved review, which was a book called Turpentine and War. Remember it?
Yes, Stefan Hartmann's.
That's right. It's completely brilliant and totally unexpected. It's published by Pantheon, which is sort of part of the Knopf group. You know, it's very much in the tradition of Sebald. It's just deeply moving. It's not for everybody. It's not an easy book, and it's a painful book in many ways. But I just thought it was wonderful. That was the last book I read, a new book I read, that I was really knocked over by.
Well, there are so many stories in your book about so many great books, lots of gossip in here. Anyone who's interested in reading or in the publishing process, I'm sure will be interested in reading Avid Reader by Robert Gottlieb. Bob, thank you again for being here.
And thank you.
My colleagues Greg Coles and John Williams join us now to talk about what we and other people are reading. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
So let's talk about the other people first. Greg, what's new on the bestseller list?
Pretty much everything. There are 5 new titles in fiction. Most notably, Ian McEwan's new novel Nutshell makes its debut at number 7 on the fiction list. And Anne Patchett goes right to the top in her first week with her new novel Commonwealth. What's notable about that book is she's written nonfiction before, but all of her fiction has been kind of pointedly non-autobiographical. And now for the first time she's written what she's saying outright is a very autobiographical novel. This is about a blended family like the one that she grew up in.
She and I spoke this summer together at a literary gathering, and she said such an interesting thing, which is that with each book, she sets up a private goal that no one would be able to tell, kind of outside as a reader, and often they have to do with time. One book might take place within 24 hours, and one might take place over the course of generations. And I just love that idea.
So kind of setting herself a formal challenge, a technical challenge.
Yeah. What's new on nonfiction?
There are 9 new titles in nonfiction. One of them that struck me as a little bit weird, so I wrote about it in the column this week.
Weird in a good way.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book. It is a botany book by a German forester named Peter Wohlleben, I suppose it is. The name of the book is The Hidden Life of Trees, and really he's a forester, a forest ranger, and he's looking at trees, how they kind of protect one another and nurture their young and communicate through fungal networks underground. So things that botanists have known about for a long time, but he discusses them in strikingly anthropomorphic terms. And so, he really has this kind of human feeling for trees. He especially loves beech trees and spruce. He says that willows are kind of loners. So, he's got this real sense of trees' personalities.
It's about the ways they send their kids to private schools.
It's interesting because the Times did this op-ed piece, I think it ran in the Sunday Review about 5 years ago, about how important trees are to our well-being.
Sure.
And it was like the most emailed, most read story for, a week.
So this book debuts at number 5. And then a bunch of the 9 new titles are also celebrity memoirs. You have memoirs this week from the ABC anchor Elizabeth Vargas, Between Breaths, that's new at number 7. You have a memoir from Carol Burnett, In Such Good Company, that's new at number 9. The soccer star Abby Wambach has a memoir called Forward, that's new at number 10. Down at number 15, Mike Love, who of course is one of the original Beach Boys, has a book called Good Vibrations.
All right, John, what are you reading?
I've been reading for work this week a bunch of books that people will be able to read about next week online. One of them that I'll note, because I found her first book really interesting too, is a new collection of stories by a writer named Alexandra Kleeman called Intimations. And her first novel, which was published last year, was called You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine. And that was a very imaginative, odd book. She works in kind of a postmodern vein that'll be familiar to people who like, Donald Barthelme and George Saunders. Some of the stories early in this collection are so postmodernist and kind of abstract that they float away a little bit, and I didn't really get gripped by them. But then there's a sort of suite of 3 stories in the middle of the book that are slightly more traditional, some about kind of new mothers and what it feels like to try to take care of another being. Her characters are all kind of detached and find living kind of strange, and feeling like being contained in a body is very strange. And she's very good at capturing kind of uncanny effects. And I thought that the center of the book was really, really strong. And she's just in general, I think, a young writer to really keep an eye on.
All right, we'll do that. Greg, what are you reading?
Well, last weekend I kind of tore through Maria Semple's new novel, Today Will Be Different. I really liked Where'd You Go, Bernadette, the novel that kind of broke her out in a big way. This new one, it's very funny. Semple is good company. I didn't find this new novel quite as consequential as Where'd You Go, Bernadette? But she's very lively and very funny. The book hasn't stuck with me much past this weekend, but... it reads fast. Then I'm reading a memoir called The Return by Hisham Matar, who was born in New York City, but to Libyan parents, and he moved back to Tripoli in his childhood before his father left and became kind of one of the leading dissidents against the Gaddafi government. And his father was eventually kidnapped by Gaddafi's agents and held in prison there, and then probably executed. Although this book is partly about Hisham Matar's efforts to find that out. He returns to Libya for the first time after Gaddafi's fall. And it becomes a book about a lot of things, about exile. Matar is also a novelist, and he talks about novelists who have written from exile. He talks about Nabokov and Joseph Brodsky and people who never returned to their homelands, and also people who did, and how it's affected their art. And so it's a very moving, poignant book, and very much about fathers and sons. And boy, what a life story he's had.
I read that over the summer. It's really powerful.
Yeah. I'm also reading and loving Juan Gabriel Vasquez's new novel, Reputations, which is Vasquez is a Colombian novelist, and this is set in Colombia. It's about a political cartoonist who's kind of at the very top of his career. He's being honored by the government with a postage stamp. So because it's a political cartoonist, it's a book that really gets at politics and art and fame. Parenting is a big theme of this book. He brings it all together in a very complicated, a really engaging way. I love his writing. It's very clear. Anne McLean did the translation, and it's just got this real crystalline quality to it.
What about you, Pamela? Are you reading anything about postage stamps?
No, I'm going to knock the conversation down a brow to talk about the YA novel that I'm reading, which is a book by Leigh Bardugo called Crooked Kingdom, a sequel to her earlier best-selling book, Six of Crows. And I'll start by telling an embarrassing story, which is that I was in a conversation this past weekend with an editor, the editor of George Saunders' new book, or forthcoming book that's coming out in February, called Lincoln in the Bardo. And I said, oh, yeah, Lincoln in the Bardugo. And then I'm like, oh, no, it's Lincoln in the Bardo.
In the bodega.
and it was funny because he knew exactly who Leigh Bardugo was, because she had just been signed by his publishing house to do her first grown-up novel. But this is a duology. I'm relieved because it takes up a lot of time, these series. And her first books were a trilogy called the Grisha Trilogy. She's an incredibly smart and imaginative writer. And the book is interesting to me for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a YA novel, but it's a really, really dark, sophisticated YA novel. And after I read the first book, I kind of decided, okay, I'm not giving that to my, on the brink of YA daughter, because it's a very dark world. The first trilogy was a kind of Russian-inflected world, and this one, it takes place in a city called Ketterdam, primarily in that city, and it's this kind of riff on Amsterdam. But the lead band of teenagers are all former prostitutes, sex slaves, criminals, murderers, sort of the what they
standard
call
middle school.
That's right. Just a bunch of regular kids, part of a gang called the Dregs.
Sounds like my 7th grade boss.
And I read the first one for my Kidlit book club, and the group was pretty divided on it. And I finished the book thinking, this is really enjoyable, and it's extremely smart and imaginative, but I'm done. And then I realized I'm actually not done. When I got to the end, she left it on such a cliffhanger that I told our children's books editor here, as soon as the new one comes in, and it's out next week for everyone else, pass it to me. So now I am in it. It also raises another interesting question, which is, how do you start a sequel when the first book, came out a year ago or more, and sort of how much do you signpost and give those cues to remind readers of what happened in previous books? And
do you start it right where the cliffhanger left you?
It's interesting. She does that thing that TV so often does, where they take you past it.
On.
No, she will not. She does not do a previously on ER. No, she does. She does the opposite, which she starts you a little bit later. So she lets a little gap go by, and then she kind of fills in the gap between that last moment. J.K. Rowling, for example, did it really well with the Harry Potter books, where she always starts you off, in the Dursleys' house in Little Whinging, and gets you reacquainted before setting you off onto a new adventure. And this book, I started and I thought, I have no idea what's going on. I'm just going to keep reading until I can figure it out, and I could not figure it out. So that's what the internet is for. Luckily, I Googled and I said, Googled like what the hell happened in Six of Crows, and came up with a perfect plot summary. So now I am well in and about halfway through.
And this is it. There's not going to be another book.
This is it. I'm done. She's done, but she's writing a grown-up book, so the rest of the world can discover her then.
We can only imagine how dark that will be.
Right. She held back here. All right, John, Greg,
Thanks,
thank you.
Pamela.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.